I have to make a deep dive, and that's just my nature.
Yeah.
I have a very strong sense of curiosity. And the other thing is, if you're asking me to attach my life to a belief system, guess what? I'm going to do some research on this.
Well, Brett, thank you so much for joining me on Growing Up Fundie. I'm excited to have you here today. I think it's important to talk to people, especially people with stories like yours and backgrounds like yours, because it's important to me that this doesn't become an atheist podcast. I want this to be a podcast where everybody feels welcome to come and tell their story and talk about their beliefs and what matters to them. Because I am, like, full disclosure, I am an atheist and all my friends are atheists. But I think it's important to talk to people from religious, non-religious, totally secular. They don't know where they fall. People come from so many different angles and so many different directions. And it's important to me that the people I speak to on this podcast represent all of those directions. And so that being said, enough for me. Tell us about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? What are you about? Where are you coming from?
Yeah. So, born and raised in the Deep South. I don't have much of an accent, but hey, that's just how it worked. Born and raised on the Gulf Coast of Alabama. I currently work for a water utility company in Rutherford County. I manage their internal and external communications because my background is advertising and PR.
Wow.
I was baptized in college, which makes me about what they often refer to as basically like a 10%er, which is that if you get to that age and then you have not been baptized yet, only about 10% of Christians ever fall in that category. So,
Interesting.
mhm. And then later on in my career, I ended up working for an arm of the Southern Baptist Convention for about 7 years, and then about 3 years at the United Methodist Church in their
That's so
communications division. Yeah.
interesting. That's
So,
fascinating.
mhm.
And
And that was not the plan. That was simply I was looking for work. It fell in my lap, and I was like, I'd be foolish not to take this because I was between jobs,
right.
and so I needed a reliable paycheck. And I had the good fortune of working with a lot of folks who I deeply admire to this day. So that really left a mark on me, a good mark.
Yeah. Yeah. Something that I found fascinating about the information that you sent me and that we've discussed over emails and such is that even though you identify as a Christian and as a believer,
Mhm.
you seem so curious about every other option that there is.
Mhm.
And I am the same way, so that doesn't surprise me that people can be that way, but the dedication you have to basically reading everything there is to read. Like in our communications, you've listed books that I have heard recommended to atheists before
Mhm.
as books that you enjoy and research topics that you enjoy. And I've read a couple of your articles. And so how did you go from being what you call a CEO? I called them creasters growing up, which are people who only go to church on Christmas and Easter.
Yeah.
How did you go from being somebody like that to becoming somebody who, even though you identify as religious and Christian, you're still so open and curious about other beliefs and what all's out
Mhm.
there? How did that happen?
Yeah, back in college, when I transferred to University of Alabama, not long after I got on campus, I was in a fraternity, so I am a literal frat boy. But my chapter at the university was, let's just say, not terribly good. And so I was at a point in my life where I just happened to be the philosophical type, and I was thinking about why are we here? What is the purpose of life? Stuff like that. I stumbled into the Baptist Campus Ministries building one night. They had a big banner that said free pizza. And, that will attract, college
It's
students
all of
like,
us.
exactly, moths to a flame. Yes. So I walk in, and within 5 minutes, I was pretty well hooked because I realized, oh, this place is free. I don't have to pay dues. These people are interested in a lot of the same things I am. There are
Yeah.
kids from all over the spectrum in terms of interests, in terms of some were sheltered, some were not, in terms of their personalities and upbringing. And let's be honest, the girls were really pretty. And so,
Especially at Bama.
yeah.
I was gonna say they're pretty. They're real
Yeah.
pretty.
So I fell into these folks, and they embraced me. I embraced them, and I started to really indulge my interest in faith and belief and so on. And they are my lifelong friends. We still stay in touch on Facebook quite a bit. We've actually watched each other's children grow up online, stuff like that.
Interesting. Wow.
So yeah, and these are folks who I would trust, very very deeply in terms of just their character. So that ended up becoming a very formative, I think, experience for me. And I ended up getting baptized while I was in college. But yeah, I went through a book at the time about, I think if memory serves, the title is Know Why You Believe What You Believe, or something like that.
Oh, I'm gonna
And
write
it,
that down.
yeah, and it applied more of a scientific idea, or at least in terms of probabilities to faith. Now, I'll fast forward to much more recent years. I really enjoy reading books by Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and so one of the things he said, and I know he's either agnostic or atheist, but he's such a brilliant man, and I really appreciate how he contributes to scientific discourse. One of the things he said, and I know he does not mean this from a faith perspective, but I found it encouraging from a faith perspective, was that the human body is made up of stardust, which traces back to the Big Bang. And I thought that is a wonderful thought, and we know this to be true. Actually, it's scientifically true, but it's a wonderful thought to consider that we are linked to the universe in this way from our very bodies.
Right. Absolutely. And the things that you're saying, I'm so fascinated because this isn't typically the conversation that I find that I have with Christians. Like
Mhm.
it's just typically not conversations that we have about like the Big Bang and stardust. And you're right, like the idea that there are particles within our bodies that come from stars and the Big Bang, like
Mhm.
that's beautiful. That's poetic.
Mhm.
I love this. But I
Mhm.
think and maybe you've experienced this. Do you find that you surprise people a lot with like your interest in science and the things that coming from Southern Baptist, I
Mhm.
don't know about other experiences, but my personal experience as a Southern Baptist typically aren't discussed much in church. Like, does that ever surprise people, or do you hang out with a lot of people similar to yourself?
No, I think it's surprised people from time to time.
Yeah,
When I worked at the United Methodist Church, I actually delivered, and then we had weekly chapel services where staff members could actually deliver sermons. I delivered
that's
one
cool.
about, yeah, and I delivered one about Easter. How Easter is a fascinating time because if you really take a look at the four Gospels, there are definite loopholes in the plots, but where they agree or they all agree on the major things that happened, but a lot of the details differ from person to person. And so you
Mm,
start thinking, okay, why is it that these four people, these four books could not agree on everything, but they did agree on the major parts? So yeah, anyway, back to your question. Yeah, I have found from time to time that I do tend to surprise folks. One of the things that has bedeviled me for years is the notion of miracles and how that works within the age of enlightenment. And we are all kind of children of the age of enlightenment. It took me years to realize one of the things was the age of enlightenment often relies upon replicable science. Well, miracles by their nature are not replicable. So,
mm.
yeah.
And
So,
has that ever made you unpopular with other believers?
uh, I don't think that it's made me unpopular, but I do tend to raise sometimes uncomfortable questions, and I've done
Yeah,
that in Sunday school classes from time to time. But it hasn't gotten to the point where I think people were turned off by it so
yeah,
much as they were. It made them raise their eyebrows, like, how do we answer that?
yeah.
And so, yeah, there is. Uh, I think as you have kind of hinted at, I think I've surprised more folks who are agnostic and atheist in
Yeah.
terms of how I think than I have even my fellow Christians.
Interesting. And I wonder also how much of that is just because maybe maybe atheists aren't as like diplomatic. So we're gonna go, oh wow, that's surprising. Whereas a Christian may not say that to your face, but may later be like, wow, that was an interesting conversation, you know. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But or maybe we're just not as good at hiding our expressions, like my facial expressions. But I think that's great though. And I think that's really, really awesome because I think that's the most important part is for people to see there are folks who believe so many different versions and variants and appear so often on the spectrum. We forget sometimes, especially in on a platform like mine where very most of the discussions I have with people are Christianity versus atheism. We forget that those aren't the only two. It doesn't have to be the far end of this side or the far end of that side. There are moderates, there are
Mhm.
people who are spiritual but non-religious, there are people who are religious but not as spiritual. It's just very interesting. And so I think it's it's absolutely wonderful that there's people like you out here confusing all of us and being like, you're not the way I was told this should be. Wait a second. Has it ever though, have your interest and your research ever taken you to places that bummed you out where you're like, man, I wish the Bible didn't say this, or I wish this wasn't the case in any way?
Yeah, there are a number of things that I'll be honest that really do shake my faith. There are two I can think of in particular, and these happen in the real world on a pretty regular basis. One is natural disasters
Yes.
because of the random nature of them. The second is when I see children born with incurable diseases that will likely either impact their lives or take their lives. And those are two things that I've always struggled with as a Christian. It
Yeah.
is truly difficult to manage those subjects and think about, okay, how does this fit within what I know of Christianity? Also, I've gone back and forth over the years. For quite some time, I found Easter harder to believe in than the virgin birth.
Huh.
Now I'm actually on the opposite way. I tend to find it harder to believe in the virgin birth than I do Easter,
Yeah.
largely because so many early Christians went to their deaths for Christ early on as part of as part of the Easter story. Whereas with the virgin birth, we don't have that many, shall we say, corroborating bits of evidence, or instances where people really, I guess, live for the faith and so on. But yeah, between natural disasters, diseases that harm children, and I can recall being in church years ago when a series of tornadoes came through the Birmingham area where I was living, and dozens of people died overnight. And so I'm in church the next morning, and a wave of, I would just say, grief came over me, and I was fighting back tears, thinking about, I literally had almost survivor guilt. I was thinking, why am I alive? But these people lost their lives. And so for a lot of folks, natural disasters don't shake them whatsoever.
Mm.
Fine. I mean, everyone has different things that will raise questions in their head. Those just
Yeah.
happen to be mine.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts on those things? Like when you hear about natural disasters or like genocide, things like that, how do you align that with what you've read in the Bible or what you're supposed to believe?
Yeah, the natural disasters, I'm not sure I'll ever have a good answer for that.
Hmm.
The world, has its own natural processes, and sometimes the earth produces something that takes lives.
Right.
That's about as good as I can get for an explanation. And
Yeah.
as for children born with horrible diseases, I simply don't know. There are environmental factors, there are genetic factors. You mentioned genocide. For me, actually, the problem of evil is fairly easy to manage. Or I shouldn't say
Hmm.
manage, but to understand. And the reason is this is a product, from what I understand, of free will.
Mm.
And because people are naturally, in many cases, they can become very naturally greedy or angry or something like that, then you can see evil acts happen. So I never attribute evil to God, or at least to my belief in God. That just doesn't faze me too much. And we've seen, well, uh, the problem of evil is never going to go away because we ourselves have so many issues in our head at all times. So yeah, that
So
part. And
you're
I'll mention,
saying,
I'm sorry, let me mention one other thing right quick,
yeah,
Sydney.
sure.
Part of the problem with the issue of evil, and I think it was Carl Sagan actually spoke about this one time. He made such a great point. He said, part of the issue with evil is that we look at God as a loving parent who should and could step in to right wrongs and do these different things to prevent this from happening. So, with God, you have this expectation that, oh, if you are all powerful, why shouldn't you play traffic cop? Why shouldn't you handle this? No one ever says that of Satan because, that's who he is.
Yeah.
And so no one ever, asks Satan, why did you allow this to happen? No, that's not his role. So with God as the, quintessential loving, all powerful parent, he naturally gets those questions about why did you allow this to happen?
Mm. And do you think, is it, so for example, if I were a parent, and
Mhm.
this is coming from somebody who does not have children, so maybe I'm talking out of my ass, but um, if I were a parent, I imagine there would be things that I could control and things that I couldn't control. Like when my child is in my presence, I can control what they eat, what they wear, what they watch, what they listen to. But when they go to daycare, somebody could give them a brownie, somebody could give
Mhm.
them a juice box that I don't want them to have, that sort of thing. Um, so I understand from that perspective when people talk about God being in control versus God relinquishing control. I guess my question would be, and feel free to just answer your own personal opinion.
Mhm.
If I knew that every time I sent them to that daycare, the same bad things would happen, and I kept sending them to that daycare or I kept making that daycare an option, at what point am I then a bad parent? Or at what point am I an irresponsible parent by, God is omnipotent and omniscient, by knowing what's going to happen before I allow that to be an option for them to choose to go to and keep sending them there? Or maybe, because humans don't really get to pick where they're born, maybe I keep putting him there without asking him. At what point do we say, God, why don't you step in and like stop some of these things from happening?
Probably depends on the size of the issue involved.
Mm.
I have two kids. My son is at University of Tennessee right now. My daughter's in high school. Um, I A few years ago, there was an incident of school violence in Rutherford County. I can't remember the exact circumstances, but my son did mention to me that there had been times he had thought, okay, is one of my classmates going to pull a gun or something?
Yeah.
And it was scary to me that he had to even entertain those thoughts. And I told my wife, I said, this is the age we live in. We have to hope that the day these days we send him to school, that he comes back.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's, in all honesty, there's a great deal of trust involved in the world. As one of my teachers many years ago said, it's the social contract that binds society together.
Mm.
And so we do have a certain level of assumptions that things will go as they should. But to your point, we have to at some point take our hands off the wheel and just trust that things will go as they should. But we have no guarantees. In fact, that's one of the actual things that I do appreciate about the Bible. Having read, I've got certain favorite books of it and so on. It is very honest when it says you're going to encounter trials, tribulations,
Right.
tragedies. There's three T's, but yeah, you will encounter real hardship in this life, and it does not
Yeah.
shy away from that. So that's one of the things I do appreciate about the Bible as a document, that it just tells you you're going to have really tough times, and
Yeah.
we have to be ready for that.
And that was something that you wrote that I thought was really interesting, where you said, the Bible doesn't guarantee happiness or an easy life. When a lot of people think that by following God or by being a Christian, that means you're going to be given an easy life. But that's, in fact, I would say the majority of the lives I read about in the Bible seemed pretty hard. They seemed pretty tough. They didn't even have running water at the time. Um, has there ever been a time where you questioned your faith since then? Like, since the baptism, has there ever been a time where you're like, man, maybe I don't believe in God? And if so, how did you come back from that?
Yeah, I do have occasional times where I seriously question things. Um, and the painful part for me is that it happens around significant Christian holidays. The voice in my head at Christmas and at Easter
Mhm.
often says, do you really believe this, happened? Is this all a myth? Things of that nature. Because I have such a need in my head to have, I guess, scientific data that backs up my faith. Which, I remember talking to a coworker when I worked at the United Methodist Church, and I said it kind of sucks to be me because I'm always looking for, numbers to prove my faith, which is, it's ironic. So yeah, I do from time to time have what I would refer to as severe thunderstorm warnings in my head when it comes to my faith.
Yeah.
But I there are certain things that still continue to ground me in the faith. And the other thing is that I've thought about this a number of times, especially recently in the past, months or a year or so, that even if you removed divine inspiration from the Bible itself, you would still have the most popular book of all time, and it's still the number one bestseller in human history because of its honesty and because of how it seems to understand our problems as a species, but also what we're capable of and how we have the ability to make a truly wonderful world.
Hmm. Uh, it's interesting, the word honesty that you used just then. Do you mean like brutal honesty? Do you mean the stories are 100% true? Like, when you reference the Bible's honesty, what is it specifically that you're inspired by?
I would say largely the New Testament, where they're really speaking to how we should live our lives. And this is where I think atheists and Christians actually have a whole lot in common, because if you really look at the words of Paul and James, and they're talking about how, and of course, the source code, Christ, if you're talking about how to create a society that really cares about people, they speak to that, but they also speak to these are the issues of the human heart we have to contend with, our greed, lust, all of these different issues. And with regard to other stories you had talked about, there are books of the Bible that I view more as allegories than I do as something that actually happened. But to me, that doesn't necessarily negate them. It's just simply the book of Job, for example. I do tend to see that as an allegory about suffering. To me, it's not even critical that it be, scientifically or archaeologically true. It's about what it's teaching us as people about how we encounter hardship and what do we do about it. So
Yeah.
there are certain books of the Bible where I take it more as an instructional tale than I do archaeologically proven.
That is something that has always surprised me, is the number of people who, um I've always thought that the Bible would make a lot more sense to a lot more people if it was treated like Aesop's fables, where it's not necessarily that we're trying to convince you that Jonah was swallowed by a whale or that everybody came from the same two people. It's more the story we're trying to tell you, or the message behind that story we're trying to tell you. Um, and I'm always really surprised by how few people view the Bible that way, and how there are so many literalists who say,
Mm.
no, literally, this person turned into a pile of salt. This person did this. How do you personally, when you're reading the Bible or when you're thinking about the Bible, how do you decide for yourself which stories are the literal ones and which ones are the figurative, allegorical ones?
Well, when I look at, we'll take the New Testament, for example. We do have a bit of archaeological evidence and if not archaeological evidence, at least we have records that were kept by third parties indicating the lives of these people who had, written or contributed to the books. So those kinds of things do help, I think, to kind of ground it in reality. I'll take, for example, an Old Testament tale, David and Goliath. For a long time in human history, we did not know if David was a real person
Mm,
until I think in the 20th century, they finally found archaeological evidence that indicated the house of David existed. Now, that may
interesting.
not, yeah, and that may not necessarily say that David versus Goliath truly happened, but it does indicate that David himself was a real guy. And so that is a very strong foundation in terms of, now we can point to something that indicates, yes, this person existed. So, and it's again, I, think of myself as kind of an enlightenment thinker where, I need to be able to prove things. It's, I guess, a defense mechanism for me.
Yeah,
It's a way of, grounding things in reality. Can we prove something?
right.
So, and we do also know that something approximating the Great Flood did happen. Geologically, there are strata in the rocks of the Middle East that indicate some massive weather event did happen. Now, in terms of, in detail specifics, I don't know a whole lot about that, but there is evidence of some sort of water event that took place. But like you said, there are books of the Bible that do, I think, present as simply, I shouldn't say as simply, but as very important metaphors or instructional tales. And I do like in the New Testament how they are pretty blunt between the book of James, the writings of Paul, and they tell you these are the things we struggle with as people, but these are the things where we know we can make a real difference in the world and be good to others.
Interesting. Has there ever been a belief or a theory that you've heard from another Christian where you're like, that's insane, like that's whack, like that is too fundy for me. I don't think that's what it means. Or like maybe like a common trope that is often associated with Christianity where you're like, nah, that's too much.
I don't know that there is something that I can immediately point to that qualifies for that. Um, Now, this is not a big deal, but for example, take for example Christmas. Most Christian scholars would acknowledge that Christ was not born in December as we know
Right.
it.
Right.
He was probably a early spring, late winter baby. So
Yeah.
we're looking at probably anywhere from late February to early April. Um,
What makes you say that? Like what is it that just makes you think he wasn't like a December baby?
oh, just hearing it from Christians who have gone through the scholarship on the subject and have explained, okay, here's what we have been able to deduce based on not only the stories, but for going back, reverse engineering the calendar.
Got it.
This is what we understand.
Got
So that does not make me want to celebrate Christmas less.
it. Right. Right.
Christmas is going to happen one way or the other. It's
Right.
just that if you went by the actual date, Christmas and Easter would be really close together.
And you're like,
So
there's just no way. There's just
yeah.
and I've noticed that Easter seems to be very I don't, for lack of a better term, I feel like Easter seems to be very important in terms of your thoughts and beliefs. Like I've noticed that you've mentioned Easter several times. You
Mhm.
wrote a Doubter's Guide to Easter. What is it about Easter that lives in your mind rent free?
There are, oh, how much time you got?
Because I've just noticed that's like a thing for you, and I'm curious, like if it's a love hate relationship, if it's mostly hate relationship, mostly love. Like, what are your thoughts there?
I think that it is such a powerful story. If presuming it is true, it is the ultimate hope, the idea of an afterlife, um, and that is just an extraordinary promise for Christians. But I also think that our understanding of it is very limited because we are limited beings with limited minds. I tend to think of God as this, supercomputer in the form of some sort of being I don't mean a literal supercomputer, but a hyper intelligence that we cannot fathom, to be able to, do what God does. And therefore, and Easter, I guess I kind of wish I could have been there. I think that's one of the things, because there are definite, differences in the Easter stories. And again, they all, converge on a few particular events that happened there. But yeah, I wish I could have been there, because if you're able to disprove Easter, and if you can, disprove that particular event, then, Christianity essentially falls apart. Um, the One of the things that I find most fascinating about it is the part where, you have the empty tomb.
Right.
And that part to me has always been one of the more fascinating areas, because you think about the Roman guards who would have been there guarding the tomb, and the fact that the Roman government had every reason to want to annihilate Christianity at its very inception. And that was their opportunity, and it didn't happen. So,
Hmm.
yeah, so I even heard someone say a little while back that it wasn't, in terms of the Roman Empire, it wasn't that the empire fell apart, it was that the empire became the church. And
Oh,
yeah, because Emperor Constantine was the one who accepted Christianity as the official state religion. That had actually been in the works a little bit before his tenure as a Caesar, as the Roman emperor, but he is credited with having made the final decision.
and so what it's fascinating to me. I'm trying to think of, like, I had like three questions, like, go in three different directions. I'm like, which direction do I want to go in? It's fascinating to me that there is, I feel like there are two types of Christians, including how I was growing up. There are people who take the story of Easter like you have, and they really like pull it apart and they look at the details. And you seem like somebody who looks for loopholes. And I think you even said that in your email. You're
Mhm.
like, I look for loopholes in stories. Like, this is, I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to find all there is to find about it. And then there are people who go, because of the Easter story, I know I'm good and I don't really need to look into it any more than that. Like, it's my receipt. I got it. I'll just make
Yeah.
sure I have it with me. Um, are you ever worried when you look into things like that, that you will find so many loopholes that they might shake the foundation of your beliefs, or they might make you question if you still do believe?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's always the risk you run. You just spoke about some folks just have an easier time accepting. The wife of my best Sunday school teacher ever, I remember this many years ago. She said basically that if the Bible says it, she just accepts it. And I
Mm,
looked at her and I said, Peggy, I said, Um, I wish I could do that. I said, I
right,
am insanely jealous of you that you can actually do that. I simply can't. I'm
right,
not wired that way.
right.
I have to make a deep dive, and that's just my nature.
Yeah.
I have a very strong sense of curiosity. And the other thing is, if you're asking me to attach my life to a belief system, guess what? I'm going to do some research on this.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I feel like that's really wise. Absolutely. You never want to be the person who lives, breathes, and dies by something that you can't answer any questions about, or you just
Mhm.
were told. Although it is surprising how many people are willing to live their lives that way. I know so many people, atheist, Christian, in between,
Mhm.
who feel like the less they know about some things, the better.
Mhm.
And like you, I can't be one of those people unless it's basketball. I don't need to know. I don't need to know anything else about basketball. Um,
And
but
I'll
other
mention
than
this
that,
right. Yeah, I'll mention this right quick as well. Yeah, I do think as I've gotten older, really from my 30s onward, I can see a definite, I guess, through line where I have done things like giving blood, volunteering for various causes, and so on, um, tithing at church, because I do feel compelled by what faith directs me to do. And with that, it's more a case, it's really ultimately a case of what is the world I'm trying to help build in my own little way. I can't change everything, but I can change my little corner of the world, hopefully for the better. And I see so many words of great encouragement and hope in the Bible that speak to that. And so I do feel that that has, led me over the years to do various things that are, altruistic. And there are people I've met whose works, whose efforts dwarf mine. I'm, just one person here.
Yeah.
And yeah, I encounter folks when I hear what they've done, my jaw hits the floor. So I enjoy hearing about how other people have lived out their faiths to serve humanity, and it's both inspiring and humbling at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's really important too. Anybody who considers themselves the best of anything in a room always concerns me. If they think that they're the smartest, if they think they're the hardest working, I'm always like, you either need to be in a different room if that is true, or that's
Yeah.
not true, and you're delusional because like none of us are. There's always going to be somebody, But what would you say is has been your most surprising, or maybe the one that just stuck out to you the most in terms of discoveries or things you've learned or research that you've done that's just really stuck up here that you think about often?
Um, well, part of it is things I've mentioned already in terms of how our bodies, have a stardust background to them,
Yeah.
the very structure of who we are.
Right. Yeah.
I think about a number of things that have been proven in the Bible. One of the things I heard my pastor when I was in my late 20s at Spring Hill Baptist Church in Mobile. His name was Dr. Gunnels. He made such a profound statement one time, and it's difficult to refute. He said, "Rational, sane people don't go to their deaths for something they know to be a lie." And I
I mean,
thought, yeah,
yeah, it's pretty astute.
yeah, the logic is hard to refute. Um, and yeah, the other thing is my favorite quote or my favorite verse in the Bible is pretty obscure, actually. It's from the book of James, chapter 5, verse 16. And it says, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Now, I don't want to, how shall I put it? I cannot write a book about prayer or anything like that. For me, it's a habit that is more a case of how it changes me than how I think it changes God. I do not see God as an ATM machine or
Right.
a genie, the lamp you can
Right.
rub and get wishes. No, it doesn't work that way. So for me, it's more about how does prayer make me more centered, a better thinker, a more compassionate person, things of that nature.
It's more like a
So
meditation than it is a request that you expect to
exactly,
action. Interesting.
exactly.
Has there ever been a time that you felt like you had spoken to God, or that you felt like you had seen God, or that your prayer had been answered?
Um, yeah, it's pretty profound. Um, it's who I got married to.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I I'll try to get through this without tearing up, but I feel very much that I received. I don't want this to sound terribly hokey, but it sure felt like some sort of a vision. Um, I had a literal dream overnight of um, the wedding itself. And my wife, her name is
Before
Kaya.
you like
Before this is actually while before this is actually I had broken up with her. I was not a
oh,
terribly good boyfriend. And mind you, we've been married over 20 years now.
wow.
So yeah. So after I'd broken up with her, and I ended up breaking up with her like multiple times in our relationship,
Oh, no.
and then I kept coming back. Again, not a great boyfriend. So but I remember I had a literal dream one night, and I remember waking up the next morning and replaying the dream in my head, and I realized it it felt like a vision or an instruction saying, "Look, you keep coming back to the same girl. This is actually who you're supposed to be with. This is actually the right girl for you for your life."
So stop breaking up
And
with her.
yeah, seriously. So that there have been very, very few epiphanies in my life. That was an epiphany.
Yeah,
And
God's like, "You keep asking me to bring the person you're supposed to be with into your life, and I do, and you don't want her. What are you doing?"
yeah, yeah. So
That's
that was, yeah, that's a very powerful one. Yes.
and, how does your wife feel about that? Does she have, like, a similar it just felt like it was right the whole time? Did it take some convincing? Do you like her side of the story, is it similar?
I don't know that she has any epiphany sort of story like
Yeah,
that. I just know that after I had that dream slash vision, epiphany, whatever, I became a very different boyfriend, and I was set on, wooing her, getting the ring on her finger, getting her to say yes, and that was it. So let's just say it all worked out well.
yeah, I was gonna say, yeah. And she's like, "I had a dream that some guy was gonna propose to me, and then I woke up the next." Um, do you ever whenever you're talking to maybe your kids or to other people about faith, do you ever run into questions where you're like, "Man, that's a really good question. I don't know how to answer that." Or have there been questions in the past that you finally found the answer for and you've just never gotten a chance to tell somebody about it or there's never been the right time to bring it up?
Whew. I think one of the trickier parts with our kids, I don't know if they've asked questions that were true stumpers so much as it was trying to help them understand certain concepts, certain um, bits of wisdom that in many cases they're simply too young to really appreciate.
Right.
I don't usually, sit there and go over Bible studies with them. What I do is, if they have questions about things, I try to discuss it, as openly and honestly as possible, um, and help them kind of figure out the world and how these set of beliefs help them navigate the world. But yeah, it's I find that with both of them, there are instances where it's just you have to literally just let time play out because if
Yeah.
you're in my daughter's case, 14 years old, my son is now 20, so you have to let them just kind of hear it from you, but then life experience after that.
Yeah. And how would you feel, just out of curiosity, if one of your kids decided they were an atheist? Would that surprise you? How would you handle a situation like that?
Well, my wife came from a significantly more conservative background than I did. For me, I tend to, as impatient as I am by nature, I also recognize the value in playing the long game,
Right. Right.
which means it's like, okay, I understand they're going through this phase. People have all sorts of phases in their
Oh, yeah.
lives,
Mhm.
and we're just going to see how this plays out. And the best that I can do is, again, answer questions for them. And, I think that, hopefully in time they might have a change of heart, perhaps. But I'm not going to, I think it would do no good to beat them over the head,
Right.
yeah, with, anger or judgment or anything like that,
Yeah.
because
And
I know my kids are smart enough to
yeah.
ask questions down the road that are very beneficial to them.
Right. And I feel like anybody who trusts that they've raised their kids to follow their beliefs and research and things like that also trust them enough to come to you if they have questions or talk
Mhm.
about it or at least sit down and have a conversation about it, explain themselves. But you're right. I feel like there's a huge level of trust there. You're like, I just have to trust the process. I have to let them
Yeah.
figure out who they are. Is there anything you've ever wanted to ask an atheist that you've never had the opportunity to ask them, or something you've been curious about atheism? Because I feel like you
Um,
Google a lot of things, and you research a lot of things.
yeah, I guess one of the things I think back to something I read by Christopher Hitchens, one of my favorite writers, who happened to be a staunch atheist. He passed
Hmm.
away a number of years ago.
Hmm.
Brilliant writer. One of his essays, he mentioned that by about age 9 or 10, he had decided that he did not believe in God. He thought there was no God, things of that nature. And in general, what I would ask is, how did was there a point at which they kind of made up their mind? What was it that did that for them? What age were they? Things of that nature. Because, people will change over time.
Yeah.
I can point to specific things in the past, 5, 10 years that have changed me. So people, do go through phases. They evolve in various ways. And I would just ask, someone who is an atheist, at what point did you decide? What led to this? Things of that nature.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'd love to answer that question. So, at least for me, and I don't speak for all atheists, but at least for me, it was less, it wasn't a decision. Um, Very much like I feel people describe gender and sexuality. They're like, oh, being gay isn't a choice, being trans isn't a choice. I don't feel like being an atheist was a choice because in my mind, I started asking myself questions and I started like very much like you talk about the loopholes in the Bible
Mhm.
and things like that. I started asking myself questions about those. And the more I looked into the answers to those questions, the more loopholes I discovered and the more questions I had. And I was just piled with questions. And it's one of those, once you've seen something, you just can't unsee it.
Mhm.
But I remember desperately not wanting to be an atheist. And that's why I say I don't think it's always a choice. I remember the days where I would overcompensate. I would go to church more often. I would post Bible verses on my Instagram. And then if I felt like that didn't do a good enough job, I would post them on my Facebook. I would dress up and like go to church and make sure I was dressed the most church at church to make sure I didn't stick out in any way.
Mhm.
Um, but then there comes a time where you just recognize I just don't believe this.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, Very much like I've said this 150,000 times. People are probably gonna be mad that I'm saying it again, but I like to use the cilantro example. There's a portion of our population where whenever they eat cilantro, they taste soap. It's
Mhm.
just like a weird genetic thing,
Mhm.
just like
Yeah.
the people who hiccup when they eat spicy food.
Mhm.
And I believe them that it tastes like soap.
Mhm.
I believe him. I've
Yeah.
never experienced that. It
Mhm.
always tastes like cilantro to me. I love cilantro, but I believe them when they say they taste soap. And um, I feel the same way about Christianity. I believe Christians when they tell me that they feel God's love, God's presence. They've seen what they needed to see in order to believe. They've done the research they needed
Mhm.
to do in order to believe. But I have just never experienced those things.
Mhm. Yeah.
God to me is very much like a Santa Claus figure. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, just in that he's everywhere. Lots of
Mhm.
people talk about him. There's imagery all over the place, but I've never experienced a real feeling with either of those people.
Yeah. Where's Waldo? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Everyone.
exactly.
Yeah. And to your point, I have past couple of years read a couple of books that kind of touched on this point that for most of the human population, there is that felt mental need of a higher power, but
Mm,
it's not 100%.
right,
And yeah, that's just simply not the case. Not everyone has that belief in a higher power,
right,
and I don't think we can shove that down someone's throat. We can discuss and hopefully provide useful information, but ultimately people decide that for themselves.
yeah, yeah,
And so I would not want to be the person who bashes someone over the head with the Bible. That is not going to work.
right,
So yeah, to your point, it's for most people, yes, that is a felt need, but it's not everyone, and it
right.
never has been.
Right. Yeah, and I also think that I it's important that I tell people that I believe their experiences because I know that
Mm.
even when I've had panels of Christians on here before and when I've asked them, when was a time that you saw God or felt God, nobody's had the same answer twice either.
Yeah.
No, it's not been like, "Oh, you know how every time there's a thunderstorm, yeah, every time I'm so," nobody has the same
Yeah.
story, but to me that legitimizes it if everyone were to be like, "Oh yeah, thunderstorms, right? Yeah, that's when we know God's." Yeah, definitely. I would feel like I was being conspired against. But
Mhm.
when a group of people who have no reason to agree nor disagree with one another, they're just telling their story, and their stories are all different, but at the end of the day, that's what they needed to see or hear or feel in order to
Mm,
truly believe something. um i I 100% believe what they're saying. Now, I definitely think on both sides, on the atheist side and on the Christian side, there are people who I would say don't necessarily believe, they just really want to be part of the group.
mm,
I've definitely met the teenage, I'm an atheist because my parents are Christians, and that's the reason. I've
yeah.
definitely met the, I'm a Republican because my parents are Democrats, or vice versa.
Mhm.
And I'm sure there's people out there who are like, I'm Christian because it's free food and the girls are pretty, like it's a church. Um, but for the most part, I wouldn't say that being a Christian is necessarily a choice that people make either, because if true belief is what they're feeling, then you can't change what you truly believe. You
Mm,
can change how you feel about it. Like, say you deep down are a Christian, and like that's how you feel and that's what you truly believe, but you're a little bummed about some of the things you're reading in the Bible. You're not
mhm,
pretending like every single thing you've ever read is a positive thing that you just love. Um,
mhm,
I feel the same way about politicians, right? I've never loved somebody I've voted for, but
mhm,
I've recognized that certain people were just better for the population. And I think religion can be that way too, where it's like, dang, a lot of this stuff kind of bums me out. Some of it's great, some of it bums me out, but I recognize that this is just the way, these are the rules. This
mhm.
is, um,
And I'll mention this as well. One of the things, having worked for two different denominations, I had a front row seat to a lot of the political struggles
yeah,
within those arenas. And it can be pretty off-putting and that's putting it mildly, when you see some of the things that go on in terms of political decisions within a denomination. But then you look at what a local church may be doing in terms of food banks, in terms
right,
of providing resources for expectant mothers, providing all sorts of rehabilitation services, things of that nature. And you realize, okay, these are the social services that really embody what the church should be doing.
right.
But yeah, to your point about things that can disappoint you, of course,
Yeah.
it's all the denominations are replete with history that is not on their side about various things that have happened politically in their areas.
Right, right, and much like any group, there is there are individuals in that group. So, like, you can get 10 Democrats in a room, and there's going to be one person in that room where everybody else is like, "We're not with that guy." Like, we're not with that. And I feel the same way about atheists. I feel the same way about Christians. Like, there are atheists that are well known in our community where I'm like, I don't. That's not. I don't. He's not mine. I don't know that man. He's just. I don't know what they're doing. Um, and I remember when I was even at my most devoutly religious, there were Christians where we would be like, they're not us. Like, they go
Yeah.
here, but they don't go here. Like, like, we don't, please don't let them, tarnish what you think of when you think of a
Yeah.
Baptist.
Yeah.
Um, but all of that to say, if you had any advice, so somebody is listening to this and they see themselves in you. They're like, I didn't know there were other people out there that could still be a Christian and have these questions, or could still be a
Mhm.
Christian and read Christopher Hitchens. Didn't know that was a thing. I
Mhm.
feel like my mind's been opened a little bit to a new existence. What would you say to that person? How would you recommend they move forward now that they understand they can do that?
Mhm. Well, I mean, you simply have the freedom to do so. And, God is certainly large enough to withstand our questions, our doubts, things of that nature. And I think that, all too often we kind of uh, get wrapped up in, some of the political arguments and so on both sides. The thing is, one of the things that impresses me about the Bible so much is that it is going to offend everyone. It's an equal opportunity offender, which is great. That actually, tells me that it's doing something right. That it kind of gets under everyone's skin in some way or the other, and that it also encourages us as well. And largely, I would just say, continue to explore, because and I mentioned this, earlier in our discussion. Much of what the Bible speaks to is what we should do to care for our society, to care for one another. for the folks who are experiencing great difficulty, great turmoil, who are downtrodden, things of that nature. Very often it's about lending people your own strength to help them get through. And I think that is, perfect logic. It's also a great definition for love. And for anyone who is searching, I think Christ himself said, seek and you shall find. Uh, yeah, inquisitive minds, I think, should investigate faith, because it's not always about, can I prove that I will have, or can I nail down the afterlife to know that I will have a physical or metaphorical body? Will I be perfect in every way? I'm not concerned about that at this moment. I'm concerned about, how do I need to live my life so that I can be of use to others and our society.
Yeah. And do you believe in heaven? Do you think that heaven is a place that people go after they die?
Yeah, I just think that we may be surprised. My whole thing with anything supernatural related to God comes down to one concept. I am just this limited creature, and I have no control over what the Almighty, thinks or does. And God has three answers. He always gives us: yes, no, or later. And yeah, I have no control over that whatsoever. I do think that there is something beyond. I cannot state with any certainty what that is, but I truly hope that is the case, because one of the things, as a kind of free thinking Christian, that I really look forward to, I truly hope there's a heaven, just so I can ask God questions.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful. I would love to hear him talk about things. I think that
Yeah.
would be fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, I tell people that all the time, because when they find out you're an atheist, the first thing they say is, "Well, what would you do if like science proved the existence of God, or like what would you do if you died and like God was there?" And I'd be like, "I hope he has time for questions. I hope he has time. I got a lot of them. I got a lot of questions." Um, yeah, I also remember when I was like 10 and we were talking about heaven and how it was going to be this like amazing place, and the pastor said, "Yeah, and there's going to be like an angel choir." And I immediately was like, "Oh, there's going to be a choir?" Like, I thought we were supposed to have fun while we were there. Like, everybody seemed so excited about the choir, and I was like, "Oh, no." So
Yeah,
for everybody's sake, I
well,
hope there's
my
only a choir in heaven for people who
yeah,
like choir.
my general concept is, presuming there is a heaven, just the idea of being in the presence of an almighty creator just by itself, whatever form that takes, that is more than enough. And just
Yeah.
like you just talked about, the idea of, if we're able to ask God questions, and not like mean spirited ones, but just
No.
like, I want to know, is the sweet tea in heaven calorie free? Is there free barbecue? Is there pizza?
Is there Chick-fil-A? Yes or
Yeah.
no? Yes or no? That's great. Well, Brett, this has been a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciate your just forward honesty. I feel very privileged to be in a position where I can literally just ask people anything about their faith, which usually is one of the taboo topics you're not supposed to talk about, but I feel like I get to ask people so many questions, and you were just so honest and so straightforward, and I really appreciate that. For anybody listening, I will have linked your article in the comments here, and just to make sure I've titled it correctly, it's The Doubter's Guide to Easter, I believe.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I'll link that in the article. But for anybody listening, if you have questions for Brett, if you would really like to find out his thoughts on anything that you're thinking about, whether you're an atheist, whether you're a Christian, whether you don't know, maybe you're in between, you can find my contact information in the comments of any platform that you're listening or watching on, and I will send those questions to Brett. And if there's a lot of them, Brett, you might be able to just come back and answer them on an episode. But feel free to leave comments if you're watching this. Email me if you're listening to this. And Brett, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure. I really enjoyed it, Sydney. Thank you so much for asking me to be here.